Shopify grows your business no matter how far or big you grow. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Whether you're selling your fans' next favorite shirt or an exclusive piece of podcast merch, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. Allbirds, Rothy's, Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. As this is an episode of our Seat at the Table special series where we look into the life, career, and legacy of cabinet members from the very beginning, I am joined by two special guests today, fellow podcasters, Cody and Stephen, who are the co-hosts of the Imperfect Men podcast. Cody and Stephen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us on your show.
So I've really been enjoying your podcast thus far, exploring the various figures of the founding generation. And though you do cover some names that we have already heard of, like John Adams and Samuel Adams, the fact that you also cover some obscure figures like we've had in the Seat at the Table series, it warms my heart. I'm not the only one who cares about these people.
You've never heard of Andrew Adams? The third Adams? Or Thomas Fourth? We're only an Adams pod.
It's like, you know, the forgotten brothers of these folks.
Yeah.
Well, before we shift into talking about our cabinet member today, I wanted to give you all an opportunity to share with our audience, for folks who haven't discovered your podcast yet. Tell us a little bit about Imperfect Men and where folks can find you.
So Imperfect Men, it's one of the ever proliferating family of Rexipods. This one we do Founding Fathers of the United States. Basically, if you signed any of the founding documents of this country, you're getting an episode. And plus some others who are usually regarded as such, like Thomas Paine, like Paul Revere, I think we got scheduled for at some point. But yeah, so we're just going through all of them. We rate them like in the Rexipod format according to different categories. How influential were they in the founding documents? What influence they had outside of those? The ever juicy, scandalous stuff that they were involved in, what they look like, and we decide at the end if they're a founding father
or a floundering father.
He's got to do that. He's got to do that every time. So, and you can find us Apple, Spotify, go to Acast, and he's the guy that knows everything, and I'm the guy that knows nothing. So, I just kind of sit there and smile and make stupid jokes every once in a while.
I'm the Johnny Carson. You're the Ed McMahon.
Yeah, exactly.
Because people of our generation are totally going to get that reference.
Yeah, they will.
Ho, ho, ho.
Yeah, I wish I could do his loud. Ho, ho, ho. I can't do it.
I'll just start wearing a turban.
Don't do that.
No Karnak.
But yeah, you can find us on Apple, Spotify, and then you can find us on our Twitter page. I will not call it that other thing. I'm usually pretty active on there.
I just got a new phone and had to switch to the new icon on the app, and it was like, come on, no, I miss my Twitter.
Oh yeah, that's us in a nutshell.
Yeah. Two idiots talk about stuff.
Talk about founding fathers.
Yep.
And I'll be sharing information about Imperfect Men on my social media around the release of this episode. I can't recommend it enough. It's actually one that's on my regular rotation. So hopefully for our audience, it will become a podcast on your regular rotation as well.
Thank you so much.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.
With that said, it is time to start talking about our cabinet member. Now, would y'all like to take a guess at who we're going to be talking about? Because Cody and Steven opted not to know who this person is.
I don't even have a guess because I wouldn't even have any clue who it could be, like, not at all.
So I tried to game this out a little bit. So I'm like, okay, what was the most recent person you ranked? I'm like, okay, I had to think about it. I'm like, how many recordings might have in the can that aren't released yet? So I'm going to go out on a limb and ask a question. Is this cabinet member the son of somebody who Steve and I will do on our show at some point?
No.
No, okay, so it's not Richard Rush. Is it John C. Calhoun?
It is not.
Okay, all
It's
right.
a fail.
All right, that's it. That was my guess. I failed.
But those were good guesses because we are around that time. We're dealing with some of the last members of the Madison cabinet. We're starting to move into the Monroe cabinet. But this one is solely in the Madison cabinet because today we are going to be talking about Alexander J. Dallas.
I know absolutely nothing about
this is going to be fun.
This is going to be a unique experience for me because I'll be in your shoes.
Yeah, and then I'll be in the worst shoes.
Yeah, you'll be in no shoes.
Yeah, you're shoeless over here.
Well, hopefully by the end of this episode, you'll definitely know more. And I think we've got quite a bit to discuss with Dallas. So
okay.
Just getting us started at the very beginning. Alexander J. Dallas was born on June 21st, 1759 in Kingston, Jamaica. So he's one of those, we haven't had too many, but we have had some cabinet members who have been born abroad, and he is one of them. He is the son of Dr. Robert Dallas and Sarah Cormack Dallas. And he has Scottish heritage on his father's side, Irish on his mother's side. And he can actually trace back his father's lineage back to 1279. So this is a long-standing family of Scots.
What's even weirder that he was born in Jamaica then.
I mean, it was a British colony at the time.
I guess so. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and we'll be talking a little bit about Jamaica as we go along. Funny enough, this is actually the second marriage for both Robert and Sarah Dallas. Both were widowed. And Alexander was the third of 6 children born to the couple. But, Jamaica, of course, Caribbean climate, and they were concerned about the climate's impact on his health and the lack of educational opportunities available for their children in Jamaica. So when Alexander was about 5, Dr. Dallas moved his family first to Edinburgh, then London. And Alexander and his brothers were enrolled in an academy in Kensington. This academy was conducted with what Dallas's biographer Walters described as, quote, an unorthodox course of instruction to develop their, quote unquote, reasoning faculties. English was the primary language of study, though French, Greek, and Latin were also taught. And it was while at the school. And so one of the things that we're going to see in this episode is that Dallas ended up meeting so many big names of the time. And this started very early on because while he was at this school, he actually met Dr. Benjamin Franklin, the Benjamin Franklin. Wow. Because
that's a good somebody to know.
I know, right? And it's funny. So his grandson was a student at this academy. So he got to meet Benjamin Franklin.
Oh,
And was this the grandson who
Went with him to like sign the Treaty of Paris or something, or because I like there, or I knew he had.
I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah, and I know this was one of the things with folks who were traveling abroad at the time, like with the Adamses, with Jefferson, they would bring their kids and enroll them in schooling. And so apparently that's what Franklin did for his grandson at this time. And supposedly Franklin, quote, invited Alexander to his home frequently. So it wasn't just that he met him once. It seems like they actually were able to converse and had somewhat of a relationship.
Did Ben Franklin take him under his wing and teach him like all the naughty stuff that he was up to?
If he did, it doesn't seem like it stuck, but you know, he may have passed along a few tricks that were up his sleeve. But sadly, his father, Dr. Robert Dallas, passed away in 1769 when Alexander was 10. And his mother, Sarah, remarried a third time to a British captain, Captain Sutherland. And they, along with Alexander's sisters, moved to Devonport. The Dallas boys remained at the academy in Kensington, and rather than going to visit his mother and stepfather at breaks, Alexander often went to the home of his mother's sister in London. Upon leaving school at the age of 18, Alexander had to decide where his career was leading. Now, Cody and Stephen, I know you've talked about this on your podcast. Do you want to take a guess as to what career he was going into?
I'm gonna go with biologist. I'm kidding. He's a lawyer, right?
Of course, he was a lawyer. He decided he wanted to become a lawyer.
Always, everybody's a lawyer.
It's like I get happy and excited when I read, like, I'm researching somebody and I realized
I haven't heard the word lawyer mentioned once. Is this guy not a lawyer? Oh my god! I get like
overexcited because it's just like I'm sick of talking about lawyers.
Well, and we'll have a little bit to discuss. He did have some kind of veered away from the law at times, so we'll discuss more as we go along. And even at the beginning, he actually, before he could really go down this career path, he learned that his father's estate had been mismanaged and that the family was in an unstable financial situation. So his uncle, in order to start to make some quick money, arranged for Alexander to become a clerk at his mercantile house. And that was in London. And so the next 2 years meant long hours of work, which his biographer, Raymond Walters Jr., credits for helping hone Dallas's, quote, powers of concentration and endurance. Unfortunately, the mercantile house folded in 1779, so Alexander returned to his mother's home in Devonport, only to find that they were preparing to move back to Jamaica. And so this is going to be now his second time going to Jamaica because he decided to join them. While waiting to move, he used the opportunity to continue his studies, as well as reacquaint himself with a young woman he had met when he visited 2 years prior to sort out that financial situation. The young woman was the nearly 16-year-old granddaughter of the Sutherland's neighbor. Her name was Arabella Maria Smith, but she was more commonly known as Maria. And Maria was close friends with Alexander's sister Charlotte and did not think much of them when they first met, describing him as, quote, an arrogant, impetuous young man.
I've been called that a few times.
literally stole the line right from my mouth.
I got you. I got to you before you could.
But it seems like when he came back 2 years later, she pronounced him to be, quote unquote, much improved. While Alexander was smitten and proposed marriage immediately. He was like, okay, hey, good to see you again. Let's get married.
What, not wasting any time.
Well, and he was like, oh, you like me now? Want to get married? It's kind of like a quick turn. I was like,
and I'm sorry, did you say she was 16?
Yes. So nearly 16 at this point.
Nearly 16. That means she was 15.
Oh no.
Yeah.
No.
Well, it's a
Yes.
different time.
I still don't like it.
Well, and it seems like her family kind of felt along the same lines as y'all because they cautioned it away in their nuptials, particularly since Maria's father, Major George Smith, was away in service in, you guessed it, Jamaica. So where Alexander's going. But of course, it would take time to get word to him, make sure that he was okay with the marriage. And I mean, they were going there anyway, so maybe he could just go ahead and meet the father and get that out of the way before coming back. This would also provide him an opportunity to secure his portion of his father's estate and complete his legal studies in London. And that seems like a good plan. That's a good, sensible plan. Go ahead, get things together, make sure the dad's okay. You can come back. She'll be older. Everything's going to be good, right?
Yeah.
So guess what he did?
I don't know if I want to guess. Do I want to guess?
Go for it.
I'm not guessing.
So while they were en route to Jamaica, his sister Charlotte married Captain George Anson Byron, and she asked her brother to accompany them back to England as an escort until she was officially accepted into the Byron family. And in case you're wondering, yes, this is that Byron family that would later produce the poet Lord Byron.
Okay. So they're already, kind of, because I think Lord Byron's like the sixth bearer or whatever. So like by this point, they're probably already like in with the aristocracy and that kind of, marrying up, which you said the guy was the captain of the ship?
Yes. So he was a captain.
So if he's like the captain of the ship, because when marriages take place on board a ship, like the captain's usually the one marrying the people. Who marries the captain?
That's a good question.
Does the captain marry him? Does he officiate his own wedding?
That would be funny, though. I don't know if he was like a naval captain or if he was in some other part of the armed forces, but somehow he was on the ship and he decided to just go back. But that would be funny, officiating your own wedding. But, on the high seas, anything goes.
Yeah, pretty much.
Especially
this time, it's like, people die very quickly and often. You gotta
live fast and loose.
Yeah, right.
Get it where you can find it, I guess.
Well, and so, with this new plan, go back to England, escort her, Alexander agreed. And so 3 months after leaving, this was only 3 months. He was supposed to be gone to Jamaica for a bit, meeting the father, getting his father's estate settled, come back, get his legal studies done. There's supposed to be, a couple of years or so. But instead, 3 months after leaving, he was back again in Davenport, asking Maria to marry him and come to Jamaica. And the family, of course, 3 months after they initially objected, continued to object. But Alexander devised a scheme where he got lodgings in a village near Exeter, establishing him as a legal resident, then met with the curate of the local church, who he convinced to, quote, hold their marriage ceremony some morning before 12 o'clock. This strict conformity with high church canonical law made Maria feel that she was not really eloping. So everything's good with the church.
Yeah, whenever you hear something starting with devised a scheme,
it doesn't bode well.
Yeah.
But the scheme worked. On September 4th, 1780, they were wed, with Alexander's brother Charles giving Maria away. Alexander was 21, while Maria, who had been nearly 16 before, was now officially 16.
Oh.
Yeah.
Don't like it.
Her family finally came around, and 3 months later, they were on a ship heading to Jamaica. So he's finally really going to Jamaica for real this time. But when the young couple arrived in the spring of 1781, they were able to get reacquainted not only with Alexander's family, but also with Maria's father, Major Smith, who she had not seen since she was an infant. So he had been stationed abroad for that long of a period of time.
So he's basically a stranger to her, really.
Exactly. So, hello, father that I don't really know. Good to see you.
How's
your life been?
Yeah.
And in short order, Alexander was actually admitted to the bar in Jamaica, so now he is officially a lawyer.
He's in the Caribbean. Why can't he be a pirate?
No, right? Go on a different career trajectory. You've got more opportunities in the Caribbean. Now, while this all sounds good, young couple, new career, everything's good. Unfortunately, family drama over Alexander's father's estate, as well as Maria falling ill soon after, made it so that things weren't quite so bright and shining. It also didn't help that while Maria was ill, her father suffered from sunstroke and died, which meant that Alexander now had to arrange for the settlement of Major Smith's estate while he was also working on settling his own father's estate.
Yeah, that's got to be rough because, like, I've had to deal with estate law myself, and it's a pain in the butt. I can only imagine what it was like back then with, no technology to really help you. You have all the right paperwork.
If that paperwork is lost, it's lost. Yeah, I can imagine.
And those people had big estates too. So, like, I'm sure they had a lot of stuff that, like, had to be divvied up, and that would probably take months to do something like that back then. Over years almost, probably.
I mean, it took me close to a year to settle my mom's stuff, so it's like,
yeah,
then, it would take a long time.
Yeah.
Well, and part of that estate, and because this was in Jamaica, Maria inherited 6 enslaved individuals who she sold for around $2,000 in order to fund the couple's planned move from Jamaica. So here we get to a point that I know y'all have come up to in your podcast.
Unfortunately.
We have slavery and we have Alexander and Maria benefiting from the enslavement of individuals and the sale of human beings.
Yeah.
It's inescapable in this time.
Yeah, it's just it was just everywhere. It's just ridiculous.
Like, even the people who didn't own,
you didn't enslave people. It's like they're still almost like plugged into the system. Like, even if they didn't really want to, it's like they still have to deal with this horrific
garbage.
Yeah.
And, and we'll probably come back to this as we get to the end and start our evaluation. But, this was a case of they were just, after all of this, they were looking for any means to be able to move from Jamaica. And they ultimately decided that their best option was going to Philadelphia rather than going back to England. And part of this was that it was easier to get established in the new United States versus going back to England. So on April 10th, 1783, Alexander and Maria set sail for New York, from which they would proceed to Philadelphia. And as noted by Walters, quote, on June 17th, 1783, Alexander James Dallas took the oath of allegiance to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and thus became an American citizen.
So at the time, like you said, 1783, so it's like, the U.S. exists, but did they have to, like now when you become a citizen, you have to, swear allegiance to the United States as a whole. Was it not established to where they had to swear allegiance to the country and just had to do it to the individual state they were in, or?
Yeah, because this was under the Articles of Confederation, and so it was really you were a citizen of a state versus the United States.
Okay.
So it's like an interesting difference. It's like
part way to where we are now, so it's kind of
yeah.
Well, and it's interesting that he's coming in at this point because this is, of course, after the war, where the United States is trying to figure things out, but there's still so much unrest, and, it won't be long before folks say the articles just aren't working. But it's interesting that he's coming in at this time, and particularly that he's a lawyer and has that legal background. But in one of those points of divergence that I mentioned, that he would be kind of taken away from that legal career, it was actually the case at the time that you had to have 2 years residence before you could be admitted to the bar in Pennsylvania. So Dallas used this time to devote himself to studying the law as well as working as an accountant and clerk in the office settling the accounts of the commissary and quartermaster's department of the Revolutionary Army. So he is part of this institution, part of this mechanics of trying to get things settled from the revolution and move forward into peacetime.
That's an interesting transition because it's like this country that's been at war for 8 years. That large parts of it are, I won't say devastated, but destroyed. A lot of people dead. Yeah, that's an interesting, especially like demobilizing kind of a ragtag force as it was into something more of a peacetime role, but that it hadn't done yet. So
he had a big order to fill doing that. Then I'm trying to figure all that out. That would have been a mess, a big mess.
And as we'll see, that's kind of a theme with Dallas's life. He's the guy that ends up dealing with quite a few messes. But at this time that the nation is starting to develop, at the same time, this is a young couple. They're about to start a family. Because within a year, Dallas went from renting rooms in a boarding house to renting a full house in Philadelphia because they began to have children in 1784, if not before. So I wasn't able to find the dates for this, but his biographer notes that they had 3 children who did not live past infancy, while 3 boys and 3 girls lived to adulthood. But the ones who didn't live past infancy, they didn't really give specific dates for. So the first child that we know of is their daughter Sophia, who was born in 1784. Alexander James Dallas, who was named after his father, of course, was born in 1791. And then the next year, George Mifflin Dallas was born. Marie was born in 1795, followed by Matilda in 1798. And then, these names have been pretty standard, but their last child to survive to adulthood was named Trevanion and was born in 1801.
Interesting one.
I love those old school names like that. It's so weird.
Sandra and George and Trevanion.
The Snake Lord, Trevanion.
That sounds like some D&D character or something.
Now, George Dallas I've heard of, because I think he would go on to be James Polk's vice president and to
Dallas,
you
Texas
got
is
it.
named for, I think. Yeah.
Yes. So this is not just, Alexander isn't the end of their political family. We've got George goes on to an even higher office than his father.
Okay.
But it would be, around this time, still in the Articles of Confederation time, that Dallas entered into public life in his first year in Pennsylvania by organizing a protest movement to a state prohibition on, quote, the presentation of theatrical entertainments.
So is curmudgeon.
Yeah. It's like, the country isn't doing good. Let's go ahead and ban entertainment.
He's the John Lithgow character from Footloose. He just wants to ban dance.
Well, and actually he was against the ban of dancing. So he was the Kevin Bacon.
Oh, okay.
Well, that makes more sense. Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
He's going to dance and protest.
Okay, all right, yeah.
I like this guy. Yeah, that's what I like
that. Okay. Protest dancing.
So he's trying, and it wasn't too successful at the time, but this allowed him an opportunity to start to get to know some Pennsylvania leaders, and these friendships they forged at this time would be valuable as he went along. But finally, after that 2 years of waiting, on July 13, 1785, Dallas, quote, was admitted as an attorney in the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, and on August 3rd, he was admitted to the bar, quote, of the county and city of Philadelphia. Now, this is an interesting point because I know, y'all have encountered and on the seat at the table series, we've encountered a number of lawyers, but his biographer noted that he was only the 34th member of the Philadelphia bar, which sounds like this is rather of an exclusive club, but somehow we end up talking about all of these folks who have been lawyers.
Yeah, I'm sure, the membership roll must have been like just a who's who of people in that city.
Yeah, well, I mean, When was Harvard established? Didn't
It was like, I want to say 16 something.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of those guys probably went there to school, and maybe they were because that's in Massachusetts. Yeah, so maybe they went there to school, and that's why it seems like
Bar.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And by Boston Bar, I don't mean Cheers.
Where Samuel Adams is hanging out.
Yes.
Everybody knows his name.
Yeah, now you beat me to it. You did something, now you beat me to it.
I'm just on the uptick today.
But even though he was, only the 34th person to be admitted to the bar, it was actually a struggle in those first few years. His biographer wrote that, quote, during his first 5 years as a lawyer, Dallas had a difficult time in making a living from his profession, because in this 5 years, there are only 4 instances of his appearing before the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court, which was the more lucrative practice. And so his practice was really more minor cases. It was in those city and county courts. It was more office work, kind of wills and just minor things that didn't bring as much money. So he kind of struggled in those first few years, and especially with a growing family. But this didn't mean that he didn't engage in social activities, because he and Maria hosted, quote, Saturday evening dances and suppers, affairs so lavish, a political enemy charged years later that he spent an entire month's income on a single party.
No wonder he was struggling. It's like, dude, you need to stop doing these parties. You're spending all of your money on it.
He just wants to party all day.
I guess so. Like Eddie Murphy.
Exactly.
He really wants the dance. Come on. But at this time, he did make a name for himself, quote, editing and writing for political, literary, and legal publications. So this is one of those, again, points of divergence, because around February 1787, he became the editor of the semi-weekly Pennsylvania Evening Herald. As described by Walters, quote, under his direction, the newspaper reflected Dallas's lively interest in literature and politics. And later that year, in November, when the Pennsylvania Ratification Convention gathered in Philadelphia to deliberate the new Constitution, which had been drafted in that city, Dallas attended as a reporter and wrote about the convention's proceedings in the Herald. Now, Dallas strove for impartiality, but as Walters notes, quote, that Dallas's formal reports gave full accounts of speeches against the Constitution as well as of those in favor, irritated the Federalist leaders. And they tried to spread rumors that he was inaccurate in his reports, but Dallas took steps to counter these attempts to challenge his integrity with proof that he was, in fact, reporting nothing but the truth. And we can verify this now because we can compare his reports to other contemporaries. But unfortunately, as often happens, money speaks louder than words. And when Federalists arranged for nearly 100 Herald readers to cancel their subscriptions at the same time, on January 5th, 1788, Dallas edited his last issue of the paper, and he was fired.
Good old censorship in the form of making people stop reading.
So you could say this is the 18th century version of getting canceled.
Exactly. Exactly. Now, thankfully for Dallas, he had also been made the editor of the Columbian magazine in the spring or summer of 1787, and he was able to retain that post until May 1789, which, quote, covered the period of the magazine's widest influence and finest flowering. And apparently this one, unlike other magazines around that time, the editor and even some of the contributors were actually paid for their work. So this wasn't just, you get to do this for fun. He's actually earning some money from it.
It's going to be fun. Yeah, we're going to make money off of it, but it's going to be fun for you.
It's like when NFL teams, like their stadiums are snowbound, and they get people to come like, hey, how about you come shovel the snow first? We're going to pay you for it.
You're getting the opportunity to be inside the NFL stadium and shovel the snow forest. You should be thankful for it. I'm looking at you, Buffalo Bills.
Now, during this time, Dallas also took up the task of, quote, taking notes on litigations heard in the Pennsylvania courts, and he published his accounts of various cases. Again from Walters, quote, the publication of these reports was received so cordially by the Pennsylvania bench and bar that Dallas became convinced that there was need for the systematic collection and publication of Pennsylvania court decisions in book form. Now, this is something that I don't think gets as much attention when talking about this period. This was unusual. Even though the courts had been in existence for quite a while and there had been all these cases, nobody actually published them so that you could reference back to other cases. And at this point, only a small collection of legal cases from Connecticut had actually been published in the U.S.
That's a huge deal because, like, I mean, it would have been a huge deal, especially in the development of like federal level law, because even federal law, like federal lawyers and judges will refer back to state cases. So having that available, like say later on in Georgia or New Hampshire, like that'd be very, very important, at least in the early shaping of the government and the legal system by the judiciary, because now they have stuff they can refer back to.
Yeah.
Exactly. And how many cases in the modern day reference back to precedent of this case and this case and this case, and they weren't able to do that at that point. And Dallas saw this as a major flaw in the system because without that, he argued, he was like, how can you demonstrate, quote, the pure and uniform system of jurisprudence that prevails in Pennsylvania? You can't say that there's a uniform system when you don't know when a case is happening in Philadelphia and a similar case is happening in Pittsburgh. How do you know if the rulings are the same or different if it's not published, if that information isn't being shared? And so he secured funding for this project and put forward a call for subscriptions as early as the summer of 1788. And he was actually aided in his efforts by fellow lawyers, including future Attorney General William Bradford. So this is actually the second Attorney General under Washington. And finally, in late June 1790, the book titled Reports of Cases, Rules, and Adjudged in the Courts of Pennsylvania Before and Since the Revolution was published. And to give this a little more gravitas, the 5 Pennsylvania State Supreme Court justices signed a statement approving of the work and attesting to Dallas's, quote, learning, integrity, and abilities. And this would get him a lot of attention, and it would jumpstart his career in public service.
Well, that's pretty good work. I mean, it sounds like it's well-deserved. I mean, it's especially if the entire Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court is like, hey, this guy did a good job with this because we really needed this. We didn't have it before.
Well, it's kind of an integral thing to our justice system. So, yeah.
Yeah. And he was really starting to get noticed. People were starting to hear his name. And in late 1790, he received word that Pennsylvania Governor Thomas Mifflin wanted to meet with him. Mifflin was impressed with Dallas's scholarship, and so after a conversation, the governor offered Dallas the position of Secretary of the Commonwealth, which he accepted, and he took up this new role on December 24th, 1790. Now, what's interesting about this, because in addition to being a new role for Dallas, this was also a relatively new role in the state, so the responsibilities of it were a bit nebulous. They didn't have the precedent of this is what you're supposed to do here. Officially, his role, quote, was to keep the seals of the Commonwealth and affix them to documents signed by the governor, to collect certain fees, and to take the bonds of all state officers.
So something like a notary.
But in reality, he acted as really more of a quote-unquote personal assistant for Governor Mifflin, something that Mifflin desperately needed in order to administer the government apparatus and draft policy.
Well, I mean, that sounds like, especially like when you're the first in a role or an office, you kind of get to a degree, defy it.
I mean, I'm thinking Washington, of course. He's probably the one you'd think of most when
thinking of that situation. But yeah, like this is a big deal. It's like, he's the first one in this role. He gets to kind of play around with it, decide like, what
the bounds of it are, and yeah, that's a pretty big deal.
Well, and especially the circumstances allowed him an opportunity because, as Walters notes, quote, it is clear that virtually all letters sent by Mifflin as governor were written by the secretary. Because he didn't really have a strong knowledge of the law or writing talents, Governor Mifflin, quote, did not like to tackle large quantities of detailed work.
Sounds like me.
You're not taking up large quantities of detailed work right now, huh?
No, I wish I weren't.
But also, Mifflin, he also had some other issues. Quote, his health was habitually poor, and as years went by, his overindulgence in drink became chronic.
Ooh, has laid waste to many men.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which interferes with that large quantity of detailed work. You don't really want to do that when you're hungover.
No.
God, no.
So with Mifflin leaning on his skills, this put Dallas in a powerful position to guide the state government, and his influence increased as the years went on. His tenure would see various issues develop, including enforcement of neutrality as proclaimed by President Washington at the Port of Philadelphia, the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania, Freeze's Rebellion in eastern Pennsylvania, and the, quote, settlement of Pennsylvania's financial and land claims against the United States government. And so Mifflin would be involved with all these things and much more. In 1791, he and other state representatives concluded an agreement with the Seneca Native peoples, giving up their claims to lands bordering Lake Erie, thus opening that land to white settlement. He was also involved with the development of, quote, an ambitious program for the development of river navigation and the construction of roads and canals, and, quote, the supervision of the militia. He also, from 1793 to 1798, helped organize the state government's response to yellow fever epidemics in Philadelphia. So he is a jack of all trades. He is handling all of these things.
We'll definitely cover that epidemic in Philadelphia during Benjamin Rush's episode. That'll get very, very detailed in that one.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, like 8 years.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Only 8 years. But at this time, he also managed to keep up his own legal practice, and he became one of 22 Pennsylvania lawyers with the right to practice law before the Supreme Court in 1791. Dallas would be retained as legal counsel for the state of Georgia in the case of Chisholm v. Georgia, which was one of the few important cases that came before the Supreme Court before the tenure of John Marshall as Chief Justice. He would also, kind of like he did with Pennsylvania, he would collect the decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court as well as the Federal Circuit Court of Pennsylvania and eventually publish those in additional volumes of his report series that he had started in 1790. Thus, he became the first U.S. Supreme Court reporter.
And that's still a thing to this day. Like the U.S. Supreme Court still publishes U.S. reports. Like whenever you see a Supreme Court case cited, it's always like the volume number, like 597, then U.S., and then I think it's like the page number, so it's like 1050, and like that. Yeah, so that's still a thing to this day. So that's a lasting thing that has continued on since then.
Yeah, and this is where it started because Dallas's reports remain, quote, the principal source of information on the work of the United States Supreme Court from its organization through 1800. And the Pennsylvania courts from the earliest times through 1806. Now, as you can imagine, he didn't really earn much money from the publication of these reports, but they did earn him the respect and esteem of lawyers and jurists across the nation. And even President Adams said that, quote, I prize them highly, i.e. Dallas's reports, on account of their intrinsic merit and worth.
That's going to go a long way for both of us. We both love John.
Yeah, that's high praise.
Whenever the man says something nice about somebody, it's like, oh, that's a person we should take interest in.
Yeah, he didn't say nice things about everybody, so it's definitely high praise. But at this time, his career is going good. He's growing in renown and esteem. His family's also continuing to grow. And so he bought a home in the early 1790s, a few miles outside of the city on the Schuylkill River so that they, like other prominent residents of Philadelphia, quote, could retreat to the country during the stifling Philadelphia summer. Dallas would also grow more involved in social society in Philadelphia in the 1790s, becoming a member of various organizations, including the American Philosophical Society in 1791. And then in 1794, he was elected to the Board of Trustees of the University of Pennsylvania, a board that he would remain on for the rest of his life. I'm just getting tired just reading through all of this. He was busy. This was a busy man.
Well, it's like so many other, like all the people you covered during this time, it's like they had so many, like, multiple jobs, they couldn't give any of them up, or they just love accumulating offices.
Well, and as he was doing all this, he was also involved with politics, and he was involved in organizing the Anti-Federalist faction in Pennsylvania, because he became close friends with Dr. James Hutchinson, who was the leader of the Anti-Federalist faction in the state. Now, at this time, Hutchinson focused on, quote, organizing into an effective voting force the mechanics, artisans, and small tradespeople of Philadelphia who had no reason to like the Federalist program. Of this class, he paid particular attention to the many immigrants, chiefly from Ireland, who had been pouring into the city since the Revolution. Opposition to the Federalists was also strong in western Pennsylvania, and so Dr. Hutchinson wanted to work with partners in that part of the state to organize statewide efforts. He had things kind of going in Philadelphia, but Pennsylvania is a large state. And having Dallas on his side gave him a powerful ally because, as noted by Walters, quote, his official correspondence kept him, i.e. Dallas, in touch with leaders in every county. It was easy for him to combine official business with an inquiry about local political conditions or to interject an item about the plans of the Philadelphia Anti-Federalist group. And it would be at this point in this extensive correspondence that he formed a friendship with Pennsylvania State Assemblyman Albert Gallatin, who we'll be talking about more. He's also had his own episodes of the Seat at the Table series.
Longtime Secretary of the Treasury, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yes. Yeah, so he was Jefferson and Madison's first Secretary of the Treasury. And so he is at this point, he's still relatively new, but he's going to become a big figure in Democratic Republican circles. And so, again, like Dallas is making all those connections. He is getting to know everybody. And in 1792, Dallas and Hutchinson co-opted a public meeting that had actually been called by Federalists in Philadelphia to choose a slate of candidates for office in congressional elections and the choosing of presidential electors. They took over this meeting and made the meeting into a vehicle for the Anti-Federalist faction to organize and energize their faction. I mean, came in and took over the meeting.
Steal your meeting.
It's my meeting now.
I'm going to dance here.
Maybe that's how he took it over. He took it over by challenging them to a dance-off, and they just couldn't compete.
He danced his way into the hearts of America. He also traveled to New York City to confer with anti-federalists there, including Governor George Clinton and Senator Aaron Burr, to coordinate efforts in the upcoming presidential election. As we know, Washington in 1792 was favored to win. I mean, nobody wanted any other person as president at that point, but they were hoping maybe they could get John Adams out as vice president. But Dallas looked at this and he was like, yeah, this probably isn't going to go well either. Adams is too closely tied with Washington and the Federalists. So let's really focus on congressional elections. And so the Anti-Federalists did elect 3 of their candidates to Congress. And that's in part due to Dallas's efforts to really focus on those elections versus making this quixotic effort at trying to replace Adams. Now, shortly after planning a warm public welcome for the French minister to the U.S. citizen Genet in mid-May 1793, Dallas, Dr. Hutchinson, and others officially organized the Democratic Society of Philadelphia. They wouldn't necessarily be the public leaders of this, but as described by Roberts, quote, directed its activities from the sidelines while others served as the face of the society. So you're starting to see Dallas as kind of this behind the scenes manipulator running things behind the curtain.
Okay, so he's kind of like this spider at the center of the web, just, manipulating things, so to speak.
Dancing away.
Exactly.
Can't get that out of the way.
Exactly. And so he's starting to direct these efforts. He drafted a public statement, which was released in July, which explained the purpose of the Democratic Society in supporting quote unquote Republican principles. Now, his efforts as head of the Committee of Correspondence for the Society would be key in utilizing it to, quote, organize anti-federalists throughout the state and nation into a cohesive political group. Unfortunately, around the same time that it was organizing, the most infamous yellow fever epidemic took hold in Philadelphia, and it meant that the group lost the driving force that was Dr. James Hutchinson, who passed away from the illness. It also didn't help that the U.S. minister or the French minister to the U.S., Genet, did some controversial actions. We won't get into too many of the details of that, but he basically tried to work to circumvent American neutrality in his nation's war with Britain, and there was this big public backlash against that. Folks were like, yeah, we love France, but Washington saying we don't need to be at war. We probably don't need to be at war.
We like France, but we just don't like them that much.
Exactly. Not enough to go to war with Britain again. And this would put Dallas in kind of an awkward position because he had made this whole show of welcoming Genet to Philadelphia. But in his official capacity as Secretary of the Commonwealth, he would have to take action against Genet in coordination with the highest ranking members of the Washington administration, which was then still based in Philadelphia as the temporary nation's capital. And he released an official statement in December of 1793, kind of explaining, here's how I interacted with this guy, but I really wasn't with him. So just know I'm okay. He also had an awkward moment because of his position in the state government, because he had to work to put down the Whiskey Rebellion, which was a group of primarily Democratic Republicans in Western Pennsylvania who rose up against a federal tax on whiskey. In his role, he had to go ahead and start mitigating this. He had to direct officials in the affected area to, quote, immediately take every legal step necessary to enforce the law. And he had to coordinate with the federal government, meeting with chief officials, including President Washington himself, to discuss the situation. And they tried to do all they could to prevent it. Dallas and other state officials did not want this to become a thing. But when they couldn't get folks in Western Pennsylvania to just calm down, it's going to be okay, Washington ultimately called out the militia, and Governor Mifflin and Secretary Dallas marched with the state militia that fall to the western part of the state to serve with Washington at the lead. Now, as we covered in the Washington Presidency series, the Whiskey Rebellion fell apart as soon as folks heard George Washington is coming. They were like, we give up, we surrender, we're done.
Like, we screwed up.
The man himself is coming down. We probably just go home, everybody. Just go home.
So something I'm noticing here, it seems like he is not beholden enough to his faction to where he is just going to use his position and just ignore the law, essentially, as many other people then and now still do. It seems like, okay, my job is this. It does not matter my own opinion or feelings on the matter.
I have to do my job.
Exactly. And that's the thing. Initially he was sympathetic with those involved in the Whiskey Rebellion, but increasingly he felt that this was just a step too far and that they should agree to, quote, a pledge of allegiance to the laws of the United States, and acquiescence to the listing of the stills in the district. He's like, you may not like the law, but it's the law. We have to follow it. If you don't like it, do like I do. Get involved with public office, run for something to change the laws. And this situation, and it's interesting because, at this point, he is in more of that moderate stance, but, things start to shift. This was a time that Federalists were kind of on a high, but then Democratic Republicans scored wins in congressional elections. And meanwhile, in November 1794, President Washington issued a message expressing his discontent with the Democratic Republican societies. Like, Washington actually came out and said, oh, well, these folks, they're not acting in the best interest of the nation. This group that Dallas was involved in creating. And this brought Dallas back to a firm stance in the anti-administration camp. He had started to kind of soften and, okay, well, I'm kind of seeing Washington's point here. And then all this happens and he's like, no, I'm back over here again. And so he started to become more active in anti-administration efforts. In the summer of 1795, he took up his pen to write, quote, some half dozen papers stating the case against Washington signing Jay's treaty, as well as participating in large meetings and committees expressing their opposition to the treaty. And in addition, he played a role in one of the largest political scandals of the early republic when dispatches from the French minister to the U.S. after Genet, Joseph Fouché, were passed along to members of Washington's cabinet, which seemed to suggest an indirect and possibly treasonous relationship between Fouché and the then Secretary of State, Edmund Randolph. In one of the dispatches, Randolph apparently suggested that Fouché, quote, buy some American politicians who could use their influence to turn the Whiskey Rebellion to France's advantage. He mentioned two specifically, Pennsylvania Governor Thomas Mifflin and Secretary of the Commonwealth Alexander Dallas.
Oh boy.
Oh,
that's get a little shady here.
Even though we know that Dallas and neither Mifflin nor Dallas use their public office to, like you were saying earlier, circumventing the law, this also didn't look good, but there are no indications that he was actually involved in any secret dealings with France, but it's just, it doesn't look good. And ultimately, President Washington would sign Jay's treaty, and Democratic Republican efforts against it continued, but Dallas was really turning to other endeavors. In 1796, his fellow leaders were really focused on making Jay's treaty kind of the issue point of the 1796 election, but he's like, you know what? I've got other stuff to do. Y'all go and do that, because he was continuing his earlier work and arranged for, quote, the publication of 4 volumes of state laws, along with another in 1795 and a 6th in April 1801. Also, after Washington's retirement, Dallas would serve the Democratic Republican cause in the courtroom, because he would serve as legal counsel for various individuals opposed to President Adams and his administration, including Benjamin Franklin Bosch, who was the grandson of Benjamin Franklin and a Democratic Republican editor prosecuted for sedition, and William Duane, who took up editorship of Bosch's paper and continued his attacks on the administration. So he's really leaning back into that role as a lawyer, but using this as a way to serve the Democratic Republican cause.
It's like he's leaning back, like from being sort of this, being in this impartial role, leaning back into being more of a partisan player, I guess you could say.
Exactly. But also doing it kind of in his own way. It wasn't strictly politics for him. He was also using the judicial branch to really help with efforts. But one of the most high-profile cases that he took on during this time was the Freeze case, which involved John Freeze, who was an auctioneer who led a protest in 1799 to a federal, quote, direct tax on land, houses, and, yes, slaves in eastern Pennsylvania that got out of control. So basically, this was a federal tax on property. And Fries, because of his role in this protest, he had been charged with treason, and Dallas would serve as his legal counsel. However, Dallas nearly ended up in a duel over the matter because a Federalist attorney, William Lewis, had simultaneously been approached by Fries's friends to serve as his lawyer. Both of them accepted. They were like, yeah, okay, I'll be his lawyer. And then they learned, oh, wait, this other guy has accepted and he's in the other party. I don't like this guy.
Oh, wow.
So they're like literally about to fight over a client.
They are literally about to fight over a client. Because, Lewis was like, I don't want to serve with this guy. And when Dallas heard this, he challenged the Federalists to a duel. Now, luckily, before it went too far, you have the U.S. District Attorney for Pennsylvania stepping in, and he's like, look, guys, this isn't that big of a deal. It's okay. You could both be his lawyer.
Oh, my Lord.
The lawyer for Mr. Fries?
Yeah. He's sending his goons out.
I mean, the judge doesn't go his way. He'll just take his freeze gun and just freeze him.
Mr. Freeze. But they're finally convinced, just be adults, work together. They agreed. And so they served as his legal counsel. Now, though Fries was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to be hanged, President Adams would pardon him after Dallas and Lewis presented their arguments that Fries had been the victim of a mistrial. And this case in particular would prove a boon for Democratic Republicans because it brought the German-speaking counties of eastern Pennsylvania that had been a part of Fries's rebellion firmly into the faction's camp in time for the elections of 1799 and 1800.
So they just throw him in the Arkham prison or something? Is that what they did with him? Or
instead of hanging him, let's just throw him into Arkham Asylum.
So Fries, he was from the German-speaking areas, so he may have had a certain, let's say, accent. Oh man! Oh.
This is one of their folks. They were like, we know this guy. Why are you doing this? And so they're like, and they blamed the administration. They blamed Federalists. And so they're like, okay, we're done with y'all. We're going with the other folks. Now, with all of this, we've been talking about his political role and his role in the Democratic Republican faction, but he was still serving as Secretary of the Commonwealth, and he served through all of Mifflin's 3 terms in office. When Mifflin retired and was succeeded by Thomas McKean in December 1799, Dallas was invited to remain in the position by the new governor. But the circumstances were quite different. First of all, the state government had moved to Lancaster, which was further west. They decided, and we see this with like other state governments. So you see the government of Virginia being moved from Williamsburg, further west to more of the frontier. It's seen as, well, you don't really want your capital in kind of the biggest city of the state. You want it to be separate.
It's also like more centralized.
Exactly. Moving towards more of the center of the state and more of the center of population, especially as the population is starting to move further west.
That way, we saw it in our, we live in Ohio, we definitely see it here. It's like our first capital was like on the Ohio River in Marietta, and then it was further inland in Chillicothe, and then now it's like dead center in Columbus. So it's like, just this progression to like more of a central location.
Exactly. And that's the thing. It makes sense. But for Dallas, he had to start thinking, he's like, do I really want to be in this backwater? And especially, he's still got a thriving law practice in Philadelphia. He had just moved his still growing family into a new home on Market Street in 1797. So he wasn't really wanting to uproot them. Also, McKean was not Mifflin. It sounded like he could actually not get drunk, and do his job. So,
Then what good is he?
so all this got Dallas to thinking, he was like, my role's kind of changing, circumstances are changing. What do I need to do? Though he was less involved and less powerful in state government, it didn't mean that he didn't find himself targeted in a blatant political attack. Because the Federalist editor of the Gazette of the United States, John Fenno, charged Dallas with swindling government funds during the Whiskey Rebellion. But after an investigation by the State House of Representatives found no truth to the claim, Dallas retaliated by filing a libel suit against Fenno, in which he was awarded $1,000 for defamation of character.
Good chunk of change back in the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially with that growing family, he's going to need some money, and if he's still throwing his lavish parties as well.
That went straight to the party budget.
Just put that one in the party account. It's fine. So he's starting to think about, where his career is going, what he'd like to do. So he actually ran for the Philadelphia Common Council in 1800, but was defeated by a slim margin. But then, this is 1800. This is the Adams versus Jefferson fight, which ended up the Jefferson versus Burr fight. And Dallas started to get involved in this one. He was more aligned with the party. He wanted to help Jefferson. He also got involved in the debate as to how Pennsylvania's electors should be chosen, and he even traveled to Washington to confer with Democratic Republican congressmen during the constitutional crisis, with Burr and Jefferson receiving the equal number of electoral votes. And so, he's really starting to make a name for himself politically. And so soon after all that was settled, Jefferson was president. Dallas received an offer for a new position because the new president offered Dallas a position as U.S. District Attorney for Eastern Pennsylvania. And this was a good role. Of course, it was going to be based in Philadelphia. And so Dallas accepted. He resigned his post as Secretary of the Commonwealth on April 27th. Now, one of the things to note here, and something that we saw with his position as Secretary of the Commonwealth, he got to have correspondence with all these folks across the state. This was the time before there was such a thing as the Justice Department. So district attorneys in the federal government didn't necessarily report to the Attorney General. Instead, they were in direct correspondence with the president as well as members of the cabinet. And as noted by Walters, quote, the federal attorney for Eastern Pennsylvania had more frequent contact with the national administration than had any other district attorney in the country. And this was going to be key. This is giving him direct access to prominent movers and shakers on the national stage. And this was a good thing for him. But this was also a position that was going to take up a lot of time and effort. Again, from Walters, quote, for a remuneration based on a fee basis that fluctuated between $500 and $1,000 a year. So he is not making much money in this position. But for that small amount, Dallas had to vie with the ablest lawyers on behalf of the government at the bar of the state Supreme Court and the federal circuit court. He found that an inordinate amount of his time at his office was consumed in giving opinions on federal and international law to businessmen and government officials. He came to feel that he was being excluded from his rightful share of the lucrative business then being divided by Philadelphia barristers. So he's saying, yeah, it's nice that I've got all these good connections at the national level, but I'm not making much money and I am working myself to death in doing this.
These connections aren't paying off, literally.
Yeah. The party fund is starting to dry up.
Oh God, no, not the party fund.
We can only hire 2 clowns next time instead of the normal 6.
What do you mean I can't get that extra case of champagne? Come on. This was also a time where even within the Democratic Republican faction, kind of many factions were starting to form because, with the Democratic Republicans in the ascendancy, there were jealousies forming. You always end up having to decide, well, person A is going to get this position and person B is mad about that because they really wanted it. And so at this point in Pennsylvania, the way this looked, Dallas was part of the wing of the party that supported Governor McKean, but he would find himself at odds with more radical former friends and allies, William Duane and Dr. Michael Lieb. But that's the thing, you see this part of the faction that's really radicalizing, but Dallas is taking more of the Jefferson cue point. He's like, let's try and be more balanced because we have an opportunity here. Federalists really aren't doing well. The Federalist Party is increasingly going down. These folks are going to need somewhere else to go, and maybe we can bring them to our side. Maybe we can just have one party.
A party that is slowly being taken over by a more radical faction, and there's moderates saying, hey, slow down. That doesn't sound familiar at all.
Not at all. Not at all. We have never heard this before or since. So this was a frustration for Dallas because he was still, involved in Democratic Republican affairs. Meanwhile, Jefferson had already said, what's happening on the state level is happening on the state level. I'm not getting involved, even if it involves a U.S. district attorney, even if it involves somebody who is a strong proponent of my administration. And so Dallas at this point, even though he's only a few months into the job, he's starting to think about resigning. But he was ultimately persuaded by his wife to stay on to retain his connections to Jefferson and his administration.
That's something that always seems to pop up. Like a lot of times when these guys want to leave the office, the spouse is always like, no, you should stay. I'm thinking this is going way forward. Nellie Taft, William Howard Taft, not wanting to do half the positions he ended up taking, but his wife was like, no, you're going to take that.
We need the money.
Exactly.
I need the societal status.
That party fund isn't going to replenish itself. Come on. Do your job.
The party fund.
Well, and heck of the party fund. But, at this time, and you mentioned earlier, this whole thing about people having multiple positions at the same time, this is a way to, even if you've got this one position that you're not making as much, maybe you can add on a couple of other positions to increase your personal income. And so while he was serving as the district attorney, Dallas was also named to be commissioner of bankrupts for the U.S. government in the area. And Governor McKean named Dallas as recorder of Philadelphia, which Walters describes as, quote, an office somewhat judicial in character, for its occupant helped preside at the mayor's court. But this one posed a problem because the other two were federal offices. This was a state office. And so the radicals start challenging this appointment, quote, on the grounds that the state constitution forbade any person to hold simultaneously both a state judgeship and a federal office. And that's the thing, this was one of those positions, as we said, it was somewhat judicial. It wasn't necessarily a judgeship. And the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court would ultimately rule in Dallas's favor as, quote, the recordership was not a judgeship in the sense defined in the Constitution. But this wouldn't stop his enemies from going again after him in 1802 because the radical Democratic Republicans, aligned with Federalists, pushed through a bill in the state legislature, quote, forbidding any man to hold appointments under both state and federal government. So they already had this one try with what was already there. That didn't work. So they're like, we're going to spell it out. No, you can't hold offices at both levels of government.
I mean, it's probably a good thing. I mean, yeah, it's just the workload. Granted, the workload is probably less than it would be now, but that's still a lot.
I don't know if it would be less, honestly. I mean, they were still trying to figure out their laws and stuff and all that. And like, I don't know, I feel like it'd be just the same or more, honestly, back then.
Yeah. Well, and especially these types of positions, you know, commissioner of bankrupts and, you know, working with recording for this mayor's court and things like that. It was probably a good bit of detailed work. And so, yeah, it's probably like, maybe these aren't the offices for you. Now, with the bill, you know, is passed by the state legislature, the governor, who of course was a supporter of Dallas, or Dallas was a supporter of him, either way, the governor vetoed the bill, but there was enough of a majority in the state assembly to override the veto. And thus, on February 14th, 1802, Dallas resigned the recordership.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Was that on Valentine's Day?
Happy Valentine's Day. Lose your job.
We love you. Get out. He also resigned the federal position of Commissioner of Bankrupts after a year as, quote, he thought it took more of his time than the remuneration warranted. So again, he's like, you know, it really isn't that much pay and it's a lot of work. So thanks, but no thanks.
This job is not worth my time.
But even with these positions, even with all the work that he's doing, he's still a prominent leader of the Democratic Republican faction in Pennsylvania. And so he was invited in 1802 to serve on the State Committee of Correspondence to support Governor McKean's reelection, as well as to run in his own right for the Philadelphia Common Council. And both of them won their respective elections that year. In addition to serving as the U.S. District Attorney, Dallas would be involved in Democratic-Republican efforts to reform the Pennsylvania state judiciary, serving as a prosecutor in the impeachment trial of Federalist State Judge Alexander Addison in January 1803. So he is definitely keeping busy and keeping with what was going on, you know, because this was the time on not only the state level, but on the federal level, Democratic Republicans are starting to push for impeachment as a way to get out of office these Federalist judges who have been appointed to lifetime positions.
Like Samuel Chase.
Like Samuel Chase, exactly.
We talked about that.
Yeah. And just as some Democratic Republicans start questioning with Samuel Chase, when impeachment charges were brought up against the Chief Justice and two Associate Justices of the state Supreme Court, Dallas declined an invitation to serve as the prosecutor in that trial. Because at this point, Dallas, quote, had grown fearful that the radicals aimed not merely to remove the Federalist jurists, but to destroy the whole legal profession. He's like, this is starting to go a bit too far. And this could potentially bring down the entire system, not just the judges who are involved.
But all I know to do is how to be a lawyer, and I'll be out of a job.
Well, and this is a case of if you can't beat them, you join them. And so Dallas actually joined the defense team for these members of the state Supreme Court who were being impeached. And he faced off against a young lawyer from Delaware who was named Caesar A. Rodney and has been covered previously in the Seat at the Table series. On January 28th, 1805, so it's interesting that this is all happening around the same time as the Chase trial, the three state justices were acquitted, thanks in part to Dallas's arguments in the case. But if the radicals had already been unhappy with Dallas, this sent them over the edge. They were like, you could have just said, I'm not going to do it, but you actively went against us. You joined the defense of these justices. We really want to take you down. And so, you know, they start figuring out, you know, what can we do? What can we do? They really start attacking them in the papers. And for the Governor McKean, radicals tried to start a campaign for the governor to allow his name to be put in contention as the vice presidential candidate in the upcoming election in 1804. But McKean and Dallas look at this and they're like, hey, what's really going on here? Oh, they're just trying to get you out of the state government. They're trying to kick you up so that you can get out of their hair. And he convinces the governor. The governor says, no thanks. I'm not out for that.
That seems to happen a lot, at least in the first century and a half of the United States. Is like, how do we get this thorn out of our side? I know, we'll make them vice president. I mean, I'm thinking specifically of Theodore Roosevelt, because he was governor of New York, and all the Republican Party bosses hated him. And they're like, let's put him with McKinley on the ticket. That'll show him. That'll put him in his place. And then 6 months later, he's president. So
exactly. Let's get rid of them by sending them to Washington. They won't get into any trouble there. But McKean was like, yeah, no, I see what you're doing here. We're not doing that. And so after Jefferson won re-election, Dallas tried once more through Treasury Secretary Gallatin. So his friend, they've been talking for, the better part of a decade now. He tries again to convince the president to intervene in the intra-party dispute in Pennsylvania. But Jefferson again is like, that's on state level. That's all you. So in early 1805, Dallas had to consider what he could do to help to minimize radical influence in the state. And so he gathered together other conservative Democratic Republican leaders and organized this banquet, which on the surface, they're like, you know what? We just want to celebrate Jefferson's second inaugural. We just want to have a party. But really, this is an opportunity for them to come together, for Dallas to pitch his ideas on how to combat the radicals. And within 10 days of this banquet, they, quote, drew up a prospectus for a society of constitutional Republicans, which was widely circulated in the anti-radical press. And so March 21st, they hold a public meeting to kick off this new society. They are really trying to organize against the radicals. This was just in the nick of time because the radicals on their side were already organizing to take control of the upcoming state Democratic Republican caucus to deny Governor McKean the faction's renomination. They were successful in winning the nomination for their candidate, their chosen candidate, Simon Snyder. So the constitutional Republicans, they were already starting to organize, and they were like, you know what? We will just run McKean ourselves. We'll run him as our candidate. And they announced these intentions a few weeks later. Dallas would be at the center of efforts in this reelection campaign for the governor, and he even worked to bring Federalists in line to support McKean, and ultimately this worked. Thomas McKean was comfortably reelected, and the Constitutionalists were able to get a slight majority in both state legislative houses. So check that one off the list. We have countered the radicals. And so knowing that he was really key to this, the governor offered Dallas his choice of 2 state offices. He's like, either you can be Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court or Pennsylvania Attorney General. Dallas was like, you know what? I'm good. I don't really need either of those. Actually turning down offices for once.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of this he's doing on principle, which is interesting. I mean, especially for a politician, because then and now it's so much of it is just being driven by ambition for higher office or more prominent office. And this guy's like, no, I didn't do it for the rewards. I did it because I genuinely believe this thing that should happen.
Yeah, this is the right thing to do. So I'm going to do this. I don't need any rewards for it. Just do the right thing next time.
Exactly. Well, and it's interesting because, he really, after this, he's like, okay, I've accomplished what I wanted to do. And he starts to withdraw from this effort. He's like, y'all can handle it from here. Crisis averted. I'm moving on. And literally in this case, because in early 1806, he moved his family into a new home, which was a mansion on South 4th Street in Philadelphia that had previously been the home of the Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court. So it's interesting. He didn't take the office. He just took his home.
That's funny.
And it's also funny because you've mentioned this guy before. His next door neighbor was Dr. Benjamin Rush.
There we go.
Had to work him into this somehow.
Yeah.
But it was also around this time that Dallas started to suffer from, quote, excruciating pains which came without warning when he was under great physical and emotional strain. Now, I mentioned this, but we're just going to put a pin in that for now. But just know he's starting to have some health issues.
Foreshadowing. Ominous foreshadowing.
As there's still so much to discuss about Dallas and his lengthy career of public service, this will be a two-part episode. So I hope you'll join us for part 2 when we get into Dallas's tenure as Secretary of the Treasury, then evaluate his career and legacy. In the meantime, be sure to check out Cody and Stephen's podcast, Imperfect Men, where they're ranking all the Founding Fathers from Andrew Adams to George Wythe. I'll have links to their podcasts on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com, and I'll share information about Imperfect Men on my social media around the release of this episode. Or you can just search for Imperfect Men wherever you get your podcast. My website is where you can also see sources used for this episode, listen to past episodes of the podcast, and find out how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support this podcast. Our patrons help to offset the cost of purchasing equipment and research materials, as well as fees associated with the podcast, which helps me to provide the best podcast that I can to all of you, and I cannot thank all of them enough. A special thanks to our newest patrons, Alicia and Allison. If you'd like to join them in making a monthly contribution to support the efforts of the Presidencies podcast, just go to patreon.com/presidencies to sign up. If you'd rather make a one-time donation, you can do that by going to buymeacoffee.com/presidencies. The website also has my research wish list, as well as a review section where you can leave a rating and review to tell folks why they should be listening to Presidencies. Thanks to all of you who have supported me in this labor of love in any way. Anything and everything that you've done is greatly appreciated. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach out via social media if you're not connected to me there already. I'm available at Facebook, Mastodon, and Blue Sky as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads at Presidencies Podcast. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Have you ever wondered why we call French fries, or why something is the greatest thing since sliced bread? There are answers to those questions. Everything Everywhere Daily is a podcast for curious people who want to learn more about the world around them. Every day, you'll learn something new about things you never knew you didn't know. Subjects include history, science, geography, mathematics, and culture. If you're a curious person and want to learn more about the world you live in, just subscribe to Everything Everywhere Daily wherever you cast your pod.